Good. Okay. Most of you I know, but along with facilitating Mosaic Justice Network with Andrew and Paul, I'm co-director of Greater Manchester Poverty Action. My work over the last couple of years in particular has been looking at food poverty and how we tried to address the underlying causes of food poverty whilst also working to mitigate the day-to-day impact of that on people's lives. So that's become more and more relevant in the last few months. So I'm going to start really with some research from the Food Foundation that found that the number of people experiencing food insecurity had quadrupled in the first couple of weeks of the virus hitting. Now that was food poverty is always about two basic issues. One is access to quality, affordable food, and the other is ability to pay for it. And both of those things, unsurprisingly, have been hit pretty hard. While usually when we talk about food poverty, we are thinking mostly about the ability to pay for it. Of course, access to food, as we all know, has been severely hit, and that has hit those who struggle to pay the most. So there's been a coming together. I don't know how much everyone knows about the structures across Greater Manchester set up to coordinate the response, but there's a strategic coordinating group which has several subgroups, including the humanitarian assistance group. So I sit on that one and I feed into that. There's a subgroup of that is the food leads group. So every council has someone that's leading on their own food provision, their own food response. And in nearly all the boroughs, I think working very, very closely with the third sector to do that well. This, by the way, is completely separate from the national government's provision of food to the shielded list of 1.5 million of the most vulnerable people. So that's what we've been looking at. I help coordinate the food leads group and have basically been really feeding in our findings from the last couple of years with some more hastily assembled thoughts from the last few months and bits of research and expert advice that we've been able to call on. So I thought today what I'd mostly want to do is to kind of talk you through a presentation that I gave to them a couple of weeks ago, which they all responded positively to. So you can take this to be a rough idea of the direction of travel, hopefully. So I'm just going to share screen, I hope. No, I think I need to close down a few windows before I can. Sorry, bear with me. Yep, there we are. Okay, so this was our advice on what should be the next steps for tackling food poverty. Can I scroll down? I can, great. Okay. But it was really just to look at the short term and medium term, of course, have been completely defined at this time. And normally when we talk about the medium term, we'd be talking about a year to 2 years time. Now everything's moving so much more quickly. The short term is still the emergency provision, but the medium term is what kind of, what do we want the picture to be as we emerge out of the initial stages of this crisis. Can't just scroll down, sorry. Move this. There we are. So in the short term, the most important thing to do is ensuring the viability and resilience of the VCSE sector, which is to say not having food banks run out of cash or run out of food or need to close down for lack of volunteer and staff capacity. There's been quite large amounts of funding released very, very quickly to the third sector. Many would say not enough to plug the major gaps that have opened up, but certainly enough in most cases to shore up existing provision. And the government's just announced more as well, funding for food banks and others in particular. So that of course is a priority, and I think all the councils are well aware that they don't, in most cases, I think councils don't feel they don't want to be playing the role of the third sector and providing food directly, although many have stepped in to do that, or at least coordinate that. But they want the third sector once again to be able to meet the demands across Greater Manchester and in their boroughs. But they are struggling. We ran a survey of food aid providers who over half identified concerns about funding, over half, nearly all identified concerns about volunteer capacity. The demographics of volunteers in food banks tends towards older people. And so there's major issues there. The access to food has been a really interesting one, because actually there's far more children frozen food being offered at the moment than anyone is used to. So we have been working on finding out where the fridges and freezers are, basically, and who can work with chilled and frozen food, while initially the kind of dry food offer dried up a bit. So I mean, really, the short-term priority has been to provide food well, whilst not crashing, kind of burning out ourselves, basically, as a sector. But we also want to look increasingly at, even just in the immediate, in the next few months, increasingly formalized and embedded ways of working between the third sector and the local authorities. It's great that all the local authorities kind of have a food lead now who knows their local food banks, who knows who is working on the ground. And that was something we were calling for a couple of years ago. And that's obviously sprung up very quickly where it wasn't. It was the case in many places, but it also was missing in some places. And the value of a joined up system is the obvious things, that people are talking to each other. We can avoid duplication, we can share resources and knowledge and information. But it's also the ideal is that we move towards a much more joined up response to providing food, which is actually to say, do you know what, the best way to address food poverty is not to give out food. We need to do that where people are hungry, of course, but actually the best way to address food poverty is to address the underlying causes. And that means we need to look at maximizing household income through, for example, it's there on the bottom point, so advice, welfare rights, actually cash benefits themselves, including locally run welfare assistance schemes, debt advice, housing advice, support to get into work, and all these kind of things. So in the medium term, then we said this is really what we want to be looking at, how we have conversations is held at the local level, so at the borough level rather than Greater Manchester, how to tackle the underlying causes of food poverty, the roles of all stakeholders, all partners going forward. Now, stakeholders need sort of a bit of unpicking. Yes, we're talking about the councils, and yes, we're talking about the food banks and the food clubs and so on. But actually, we're also talking about people who experience food poverty, and it's vital that their input is part of it, is shaping the system that we want in the long term. And again, to embed these systems and these operations. 10 minutes.
It's 1 minute, Tom.
1 minute. Okay. So in the medium and long term, there should also be a dedicated lead elected member and an officer working to co-produce a shared approach to tackling poverty. That is how we address the underlying causes and actually move away from a place which I don't think anyone considers desirable, where we have emergency food aid on a mass scale. That we need to move to a place where that's seen as the exception rather than at times currently the norm. And again, this is what we've been saying pre-COVID and during COVID. If we can maximize income in each household, we give people the freedom and the dignity to access food on the basic terms that everyone in this society aspires to. So yeah, I mean, that was the presentation I gave to the food leads a couple of weeks ago. That's what we're working towards. We are, as in GM Poverty Action, we are now recruiting a food poverty coordinator who is the one that's going to be carrying forward these conversations in each borough.